What's up, fellow art weirdos? Thank you for coming. My name's Tom, and thank you for being a medium-sized, cool-looking crowd. I assume only cool people hang out in Regency C. Seems true so far. And we get the chillest slot before the somewhat legendary question mark party afterwards. This is my first, and I've been told last Strange Loop, so I'm looking forward to whatever happens tonight. Sounds cool. Has a good reputation. But thank you all for coming. I'm going to do a general presentation on how I spent the last year of my life collaborating with a lot of other people to make a bunch of weird art with Stable Diffusion that I am really excited to share with y'all. It has been a weird and inspiring journey, and I will try to emulate all the reactions that I had while making and seeing these images for the first time as I go through them. But I'll kind of give you the general breakdown of the timeline for how the year went, just kind of what we were working on, who I was working with, how it went, what we ended up building, and the art that we ended up making. And then I would really love to get as quickly as possible, I'll get my timer going, to just looking at some art and maybe doing like actual Q&A time, because I would really love to know what you all think of this. And I have not gotten enough feedback on any of this. It's just been kind of a whirlwind. So, with all that said, this is an old school presentation. I taught art for a long time. Like, my lecture notes are what appear on the screen, so apologies. But it is nice because you can either read or listen to me. And I will try to not get stuck on any one slide for too long. But you got some multiple images here. Most of these images are going to be outputs from artist fine-tunings, which I'll talk about in a second. But just to state the goals, as I kind of did for the presentation, I really just want to share how this year went and what we made, what we built, what we learned, and kind of what's next for the project. And that will include, but not be limited to, honing in a little bit on textual inversion training. I won't get bogged down in the weeds too much on that, but if you know what that is, I will be referencing it and talking about how important it was to the project. Stable Diffusion will, of course, be covered to some extent. Gradio and Hugging Face deployments of these sorts of projects will get covered also. And then maybe most excitingly, or freshest in my mind, we'll touch on these University of Alaska like artist workshops that I got to do last week. 5 days a week, that was really cool. I'll get into the details of it. And then these two shows, one of which is up right now in Anchorage, and one that's gonna be hung in October, which is like next week or in 2 weeks, down in Northern California where I am from. But the big guiding questions that like I'm keeping in mind, I guess, like as I'm thinking about all this, that I would invite you all to keep in mind too, as you're looking at these images, is initially just like, can a diffusion model make fine art? And unfortunately, implied in that is the question of what fine art is. I would invite you not to indulge that because it's confusing and there's no answer to it. But it looks weird as a sentence if it just says art. Whether or not that's a complex question to you might differ, but it becomes a complex question for me when fine art is in there for whatever reason. And the follow-up question of what it would mean just generally or for individual artists, for like the art world, for humanity as a whole, if these types of generative models were capable of making fine art. And spoiler alert, I think you're always supposed to say, I don't have an answer to either of those questions in this kind of presentation. I actually kind of do, but but we'll get to that. I didn't put it in writing, I'll say it out loud. A little bit on my background, just because it's not super traditional for working in tech, but I started off studying engineering foundations and fine art, like tearing my brain apart at the same time at different schools in San Francisco. I ended up having a very wise engineering professor kindly suggest that I drop out and go to art school, which is interesting. I wasn't failing this class, but I ended up going to art school and kind of putting engineering on pause and discovered a love of teaching and pursued a master's degree at Yale, which was the only place I got into, interestingly, that allowed me to start teaching after I graduated from there. And if you don't know what BFA or MFA refers to in this context, that means like actually studying studio art. So I was like painting and drawing and doing a certain amount of mixed media, like installation, experimental work in both of those programs. And then I ran away from New York as fast as I could, came back to California and taught painting, life drawing, and art history at a bunch of colleges for about 6 years and change, long enough for somebody to actually tell me how much tenure track positions pay. And then I immediately started hanging out with my tech friends in San Francisco again, and they openly and very warmly invited me into the completely different feeling world of software development in this new era of, it just felt like open information and much more encouraging than when I was in college. So it was a very positive transition, and I got to kind of sneak a lot of it into my curriculum that I was doing with art students, which was a lot of fun before I kicked out on that. But since then, I have gotten to work as a full stack engineer in a number of capacities, and I've gotten to teach software engineering foundations for a little bit too, which was a lot of fun. And all of that kind of like brought me up to about a year ago when I went to the Recurse Center after somebody told me they existed. And I know there's a few Recurse people that, I mean, I heard about this conference through them, and I know there's some out there, but I had a great experience there, and that's when this project began. And I just threw in that I'm an exhausted dad also, just so you all feel sorry for me on some level, or give me more credit for all this. And for whatever it's worth, my studio practice, like personally, is still rooted in like oil painting, sometimes large-scale drawing, although I don't have time for that as much anymore. Mixed media installation, when somebody gives me the key to a weird gallery and says, do whatever you want. I did a fun visual arts survey that's linked on my website that I'll have up later a few years ago. That was a cool data visualization kind of project. And then I just did this series of needlessly accurate computer sculptures that I sculpted by hand for some reason. And that's a wax cast of a clay sculpture of an IBM 5150 there that has a companion Apple II and C64 to go with it. So sort of a interesting historical interlude. But all of that is just to set the context that within this project, I have found myself more comfortable in the context of the Astronaut Horse project as a contributing artist and facilitator who ends up kind of pulling folks together and reaching out to people and connecting people rather than taking some lead role. One of the more exciting things about this project has been the collaborative aspect of it. And I feel like I'm getting to play kind of a role in that as an artist who's making work that doesn't necessarily have anything to do directly with doing fine-tunings with Stable Diffusion. So a couple of slides kind of squished together here just to stay on track, but just to be very clear about what Astronaut Horse is, because it's a confusing name. It is a bunch of different things. It's an open-ended project, but the core of it is just trying to bring visual artists, like practicing visual artists and art students, together to work on things related to Stable Diffusion with researchers and software engineers, mostly from the Recurse Center, but increasingly kind of reaching out of that community too for the tech side of all that. And the product of those collaborations so far has been kind of pluralized, so it's not necessarily taking any one strong direction. It's kind of in the Cambrian explosion phase of trying different things out. But so far, these fine-tuned concepts that are trained using textual inversion on artist-chosen images have formed the core of the project. It's been just the most, I don't know, like stimulating for the artists and I think for the tech folks, and it continues to kind of be the core of it and building on that. But also along the way, this live web application happened under a Hugging Face grant, which is really cool. That's running certain aspects of the project, but most interestingly, the like actual artist fine-tunings are all up there, and it gets like redeployed every 24 hours and adds more potentially if people have done more trainings. But I'll talk about that more in a bit. And then a growing series of Python Colab notebooks for tools that are involved in like the workflows that we're kind of discovering that for whatever reason aren't really appropriate to put onto the deployed app, like doing the textual inversion training, which takes too long and locks up the GPU. So it's not something you'd want to stick on an app, but a number of other things too. And all of these, pretty much everything I'm referencing here too is just linked on the static site, the astronaut.horse website too, if you want to check any of it out or use any of it. But I'll plug that later too. And then recently, the project has kind of culminated into I'm just going to call it a series, even though there's only 2 on the calendar right now, but actual like in-person, semi-traditional art gallery shows, which I was very surprised anyone was interested in and which I did not really solicit, but that is another interesting aspect that's happening more in real time, because again, there's a show up right now in Anchorage and another one going up in October. And this wacky Discord server has become a part of the project as just a place for the art folks and Recurse Center folks and tech folks to overlap and actually be able to converse somewhat, but primarily it's just a place for me to abuse Discord servers and dump hundreds and hundreds of images every time the fancy strikes me onto somewhere that's not my computer, and also somewhere that can be accessed by other people. And these in-person workshops that go along with the gallery shows, seemingly, that's probably how it's going to keep working for now. And just to be very clear, Astronaut and horse, if you have not seen the kind of ubiquitous benchmark image of an astronaut riding a horse as a way of showing off how amazing kind of diffusion models in general, but definitely Stable Diffusion, is at generating realistic, unimaginable images, that's where that term is from. Maybe you've seen it. If not, check out the Stable Diffusion website, or the Wikipedia page for Stable Diffusion. There's always a good astronaut horse on there. And I don't need to get into the weeds on my time at the Recurse Center necessarily, but all those dates are just up there to kind of remind me that I came into the Recurse Center with completely different intentions of like building out a weird, useless like Instagram alternative, or continuing to develop this zine bot that is still like a side project that I maintain and use a lot. In line with how you're supposed to experience Recurse Center, did not realize what I was actually going to focus on until I was about halfway through the program, and then very rapidly got involved in working with Stable Diffusion, which was coming out and developing like kind of at the same time. The timelines overlapped just coincidentally, and then ChatGPT came out, which just plugged more energy into it, but didn't have anything directly to do with the project. And I'm going to say check out fast.ai multiple times during this presentation, because it gets me out of having to do in-depth technical explanations. But if you don't know what fast.ai is, check it out. Free lectures, amazing lecturer Jeremy Howard, and just absolutely inspiring explanations of Stable Diffusion and topics related to it. So with that said, my timeline, trying to keep it like within sort of a story structure here, when I was at Recurse, when I discovered or was exposed to Stable Diffusion from some other recursors, and started working through fast.ai Part 2, which was being released in real time at that time, like week by week lectures, and was focused on re-implementing Stable Diffusion with the Python standard library, which is a really crazy cool thing to be doing. And because everybody is really into Rust at the Recurse Center, or was at that time, we were trying to do it in Rust. It was a doomed project from the start, but we had a lot of fun initially getting into it, and discovered very quickly that the lectures were just super illuminating and worth going through regardless of our broken Rust implementation dreams. But with that timeline in mind of like us learning about this stuff at this time, this is the appropriate time to just like shout out what Stable Diffusion is. If you are completely unfamiliar with it, I will not pretend to be able to lecture as knowledgeably as, again, like the fast.ai lectures and others. But I will at least describe it in the most general sense, in the way that I do to like art students, which is to describe it as a text-to-image generative model, like Midjourney or DALL-E, or tools within the Adobe suite that have been integrated. In its normal use case, you give it text, and by bringing that text into a math space and performing machine learning built processes on the encoding in that math space, you can bring it into another format of encoding that you can decode back out into an image space. And within that process, kind of core to the description, the diffusion part of Stable Diffusion, is this idea of like denoising an image iteratively, not all at once, but chopping up this process into steps that allow an image to gradually denoise from a static starting point. And that's one of the more interesting aspects of it, and a couple of our little tools that we built showcase that denoising process. But that's sort of like in a nutshell how I explain it to artists, if anybody is like totally unfamiliar. And textual inversion in a nutshell is I don't know if I call it a more complex process, but it builds on Stable Diffusion's like core training, which is an open source set of images that I reference in here too, the Leon training images, which I've never said out loud, but maybe that was correct, which you can peruse freely. Like I said, there's some really cool tools linked on the Discord for perusing those in a similar way to how Stable Diffusion kind of views its image sets indirectly, but I would encourage you to check that out. But as we were, well, the explanation for textual inversion training is that building on that training that is trained on, you can pretend it's the whole internet. It's totally not. It's a very like select bit of the internet, even if it's a large bit. But textual inversion takes in a very small number of images chosen by whoever is running the training, like 5 to 15 images, and then through a process of essentially like embedding those into its normal process for diffusing an image out, identifies patterns within that that allows the process, to essentially create a word that doesn't exist, or an embedding for a word that doesn't exist, that you can then reference in a normal text prompt. So if you gave it 5 images of like yourself, which was the first thing a couple of folks did at Recurse Center, you would essentially be saying like, hey, whatever I am, whatever I look like, make up a word for that you can understand in the context of all your other training. And then I can use that in a normal sentence structure for a text embedding. It's very interesting, and I'll talk about it more like when we have some examples up of what ended up coming out of that. But again, in a nutshell, those are kind of the 2 core concepts. And there's some interesting limitations associated with Stable Diffusion that we noticed really early on at this time when we were learning with fast.ai. But the most interesting one that was in part why we ended up like going with this name of Astronaut Horse was that the horse cannot ride the astronaut. I don't know if anybody's ever like tried to plug that in. Absolutely not. Not with Photoshop's tool. Not with any open source or for-profit implementation of a diffusion process that I have seen. And when you pull over, if you pull over to search through the training images, you will see very quickly that the reason it is able to, these models are able to create images of astronauts riding horses is because we trained them with hundreds and hundreds of images that humans made, graphic designers and illustrators and painters made of astronauts riding horses. Not a big secret. And if you reverse that, very few, if any, I never found any image in that particular training set that showcased a horse riding an astronaut, but it would be a worthy subject for an artist to pursue at some point and flood a data set with, so that we can get past this very serious roadblock in the evolution of our species. And my big moment with it too, because I'm an art history nerd, was noticing that all of these demos in fast.ai and elsewhere showcase like Van Gogh and Vermeer, the painters, disconnected painters, but both European historical painters, as, again, sort of like benchmark tests. Like, look, I can make a picture of like a teddy bear as if Van Gogh painted it. I can make a painting, or I can have this Stable Diffusion process make a painting of Girl with a Pearl Earring, the famous Vermeer painting, but it's a dog instead of a girl, and getting really amazing output. And my first thought was, they have an order of magnitude difference between them in terms of how much work they made. Like Vermeer has maybe like 30 works attributed to him, and Van Gogh has like hundreds and hundreds. There's 300 is too small, but I think it's like 300 paintings the last time I was diving into a book on him. But that seemed odd to me because they seemed equally capable. And again, searching through the data set, or the training image set, I did not quite know what to make of the sort of retrospectively obvious fact that the reason that these models are good at doing these things is because we just showed them how to. So even though Vermeer only made like a few paintings in his lifetime, and definitely none where a dog was dressed up like a woman with a pearl earring, hundreds and hundreds of humans have imitated Vermeer's painting style, students, artists, et cetera, and posted them on the internet, which allowed them to end up in this training set. And I don't know like what it breaks down to in terms of how many people have imitated Van Gogh versus Vermeer, but essentially there's enough images just painted by people who are not Vermeer that they end up having like a basically comparable representation in the data set and capability in a diffusion model. And then the last sort of section that has to be mentioned, even though it oddly has not come up with any of the artists I have talked to, is just the general question of ownership and copyright. And first of all, this project never felt like it was in danger of crossing a line because there was never any interest in trying to make this a money-oriented project. And the goal in all my conversations with visual artists was to build artist agency, critical agency, just meaning like a kind of ownership over this process, feeling like they understand how it works and can critique the process, and not feel like subject to it, like it's a sort of like magic entity that they couldn't possibly like break into or understand or have any agency over. And with that goal in mind, I don't think we ever it didn't feel like we ever strayed towards murky waters with ownership, and especially the state the project is in now. We've kind of figured out processes that just feel more academic and experimental and just up to the artists to use in any way they see fit. But it's kept the project on track, and it kind of got sort of cemented by this phrasing that these images belong to everyone and no one, which I think the artists have responded really well to. And again, if there's any one interesting thing to note there, it's that it just has not come up. And I have been sort of waiting for it to come up. So maybe somebody can ask a really good question about it and see how much I've actually thought about it. The next phase of this, after sort of identifying that textual inversion training was really capable and learning more about Stable Diffusion, doing some implementations, somebody, again at Recurse Center, randomly mentioned that Gradio was a thing that existed. Maybe some of you have encountered it. But in a nutshell, it's a really simple way, it's a Python library that creates a very simple process for making user interfaces for these types of projects. So if you have a working Colab notebook or a working Python notebook, it's fairly easy to just slap a Gradio application onto it. It's oversimplifying it a little bit, but it's very easy to use and just make like an interface like Automatic 1111, if anybody's messed around with that, can be used in this way with just a Gradio interface slapped on top of a bunch of complex processes in a Python notebook. And then Hugging Face Spaces also came onto our radar while being exposed to Gradio. I was doing a Gradio implementation of not the actual like textual inversion training, but just some like demo Stable Diffusion processes for a Recurse presentation. And then Hugging Face Spaces just came up. Hugging Face owns them, so it's not surprising, but that again just creates a very easy process for taking a Gradio application that is maybe working essentially on top of a Colab notebook and then tossing that into a deployed space that you can actually use on the internet and have other people use and share openly, which is not something you can do when you're just using Gradio with Colab. So some of you may have encountered Hugging Face Spaces. It is a very cool aspect of what they provide for the machine learning community, and it's very easy to use. But I found out very quickly in doing that presentation, I decided to just go for it and see what happened. I've never deployed like a GPU hardware project, and I immediately got a bill for many hundreds of dollars that I did not have because I was very unemployed at Recurse Center, which is the way of the Recurse Center. And I wrote them a very nice, sad-sounding email about how I was a former teacher at Recurse Center and I didn't have hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and I did this for a demo, promoting their products and services or whatever. And they wrote me a very, very, very nice email back, immediately negating the bill, but also inviting me to apply to a GPU grant program that they had apparently available that just didn't come up in my initial research, kind of like buried under their deployment settings a little bit. But yeah, they gave us this little GPU grant. We gave them a little write-up for it, and it's been running on that grant for almost a year. And it has just made, every interaction I've had with Hugging Face has just been super positive, really good communication and troubleshooting, and just seems generally like a super supportive community. So thank you, Hugging Face, wherever you are, for continuing to give us free GPU time. So then getting to kind of the core of it, after that application was set up, it immediately seemed obvious that you could, based on how we were running these textual inversion trainings and then loading the concepts or the tokens into a standard Stable Diffusion pipeline, which is what you have to do to actually continue to have those tokens be available for a text prompt. You have to load them in. It's somewhat complicated to integrate them into a Stable Diffusion pipeline, but it's all very well documented. And it was something that it was immediately clear could be integrated into the live application that we had, which was super exciting because now it was something that I could potentially share with these visual artists that I had started to talk to after doing the training. We had played around with the idea of just doing trainings and giving artists a bunch of images, but that felt like a weird service to be providing that wasn't sustainable and didn't really give artists the agency in that relationship. But this suddenly became a scenario where we could facilitate the artist running a training and then have it be loaded onto that live application, let them do whatever they wanted with it, and kind of along the way maybe expose them to a little bit of confidence using Colab notebooks and so on, which is always an uphill battle with visual art folks for whatever reason, me included. But we began going through this still ongoing series of artist trainings using textual inversion. We ended up working with Stable Diffusion 2, which I can talk about later, but that has actually been like a very functional version of Stable Diffusion for us, and we haven't hit any limitations with it that have been problematic. So with the exception of this one, which was the first training on Stable Diffusion 1, all the rest of the ones that you'll see for the most part are running off of 2. But this process is still essentially like a traditional reach out to an artist, somebody, friend of a friend, or somebody whose show someone has seen, trying to have like a studio visit, like over Zoom with them or a phone call, explaining the project in as brief a way as possible without letting it get too overwhelming for them, and letting them know that whatever type of ownership they're interested in having over the images is theirs to define, which is an important part of that conversation, to let them know if they don't like what happens in this process, we can just delete it all and pretend it never happened. There was a kind of workshopping period of trying to figure out how to articulate that quickly. But then once the training is complete off of 5 to 15 images that they've selected, either of their work or work that inspires them, we then run as many batch prompts as they want and show them how to use this batch prompter that's just a Python notebook to get several hundred images out of that training to kind of figure out what it's good at, and then build sort of a knowledge base for being able to use it just on the live application, which it's set up now that it's like auto load every time it redeploys. So yeah, then just kind of explaining to them they can use it however they want, and if they want to have it removed at any point, they can, if they're not comfortable with it for some reason, and then just seeing what they do with it. And this first training we did is kind of stuck in my mind. It was kind of impromptu. This artist was nice enough to send me every image he ever made, every painting he ever made. And we, at the Recurse Center, there was a group meeting about something else, and we just randomly picked out a small handful of them, and then ran a few hundred images out of that. And I had never seen the output from this kind of training like en masse before from an actual artist input. And I was really surprised by the reaction that I had and like what I was noticing about what it was good at. First of all, it was not good at rote imitation of the artist's style. It wasn't really, it didn't seem like interested, quote unquote. That's not a proper term to apply to a soulless piece of software, but it did not seem interested in trying to figure out what the subject matter was for the artist, like specifically, and imitating that. It didn't seem interested in just copying the same kinds of colors and marks. It seemed like it immediately picked up on more nuanced patterns in the artist's work. Like that was immediately clear, and my artist teacher brain clicked on immediately, because these were works that looked like you could hang them up on a wall and have a really good discussion about them in a class, like in a traditional academic critique of artworks. And more than that, it seemed like it was focusing, sort of covering a breadth of images that were diversely representing slight variations of nuanced aspects of the artist's work, like color use, color palette use, like sort of other formal qualities like composition, and even subject matter. And in this one in particular, the way lines were used in this artist's work were, I think he had just discovered a process of like overlaying lines on top of paintings and sometimes underneath. But the way lines were used in the images that it output felt to me like a visual articulation of a really good critique that you would have like in art school if you presented that body of work to a group of professors or an individual professor, sort of like a golden moment that could come out of that hypothetical interaction is them pointing out that you were just using lines to cover things or just using lines to outline things. And the variation of line use sort of looked like a visual version of the sentence, or sort of like a critique that you could use lines as windows, or you could use lines as windows into other spaces, or they could open up into three-dimensional forms. Eyes could be coming out of lines or behind lines. They could be bars. There was something really, really interesting about that because it felt so quickly like it could stand in for what is one of the most important parts of like how art education works now, which is that critique relationship with an instructor. And there was also this hint really early on that this seemed like more of a vehicle for collaboration than just for like the mass production of an artist's style of work, because it did not look like the artist's work. It looked enough like the artist's work to be interesting to the artist and to me and other people who found the artist's work interesting for a lot of the same reasons, but it did not seem like it belonged to them. It seemed like it was a collaboration with Stable Diffusion's larger image set that it was trained on. So i.e. like basically the internet, which is a big collaborative project. And that became a really exciting aspect of it too that we're still building on. And this potential for like historical exploration I'll touch on later too. So again, trying to move through the narrative here, but we ended up expanding the features on the app to kind of its current state and integrating, like implementing some papers that people would find at the Recurse Center, getting like a couple of ControlNet tabs working that have played an interesting sort of like side role in potential processes for artists, especially like making these animated GIFs using different seeds, different static seeds overlaid onto ControlNet images to produce like slight variants of the same image over and over again. So a bunch of those on the Discord if you want to check them out. Making sure the autoloader worked for the new artist concepts. That was kind of like a tricky thing to pull, but ended up being pretty reliable so that they're in there automatically. And artists can run those trainings independently whenever they want off of that notebook if they're comfortable doing it. This tab that is called ArtBot right now, for lack of a better term, but I kind of started thinking of it as like a compound token tab, and it's one of these benefits, one of the interesting benefits of continuing to work with textual inversion training rather than like LoRa models, is that you can like put more of them into one space pretty easily, and you can do that with a lot of different kinds of fine tunings, I believe. But they integrate with each other really successfully, and that's fast forwarding a little bit. We played around with it early on at this stage, but it's become sort of the focal point of the project for me, at least. It seems like the most capable process for consistently making things that feel like fine art, again, whatever that means. The manual seed entry too, I kind of throw up there because I do want to give this presentation to some artists also, and I want to make sure to point out that that was a very easy thing to implement, but a very important part of the app for, and again, like encouraging artists to learn about this process. And then we continue to build out the Python notebooks for stuff that wouldn't fit into the app or weren't appropriate to deploy into the app. But the batch prompting tool that we have that gets used a lot, and what else have I got there? Like breaking down the denoising process, a latent space interpolation animation tool that isn't showcased here, but was a pretty cool paper implementation for animating movements through latent space. That's on the Discord also if you want to check them out. They're very cool. And then an upscaler, we had to implement a little upscaler or a batch upscaler for getting images ready for these exhibitions because they had to be printed larger than their native resolution, which is 768 or 1024, depending on what kind of pipeline you're running for Stable Diffusion. And again, all those notebooks are available on the workshops tab of the static site. So this is like the most exciting part for me because I just did it and I'm super exhausted from doing it. But we got this opportunity through one of the collaborations we did with one of the artists, which ended up being like kind of our most interesting early fine tuning that had like an emergence moment. You'll see the images. I'll point them out, but they've been these sort of like bizarre alien forms. We can talk a little bit about that when we have an image up for it. But that artist connected us with doing this first physical exhibition up in Anchorage, of all places, at this really beautiful space associated with the University of Alaska. And they hung it extremely well. It was like a beautiful hang. We kind of gave them like free creative power to hang it however it seemed appropriate. I was really curious what they would decide on, but got a bunch of big prints and print files for them with that batch upscaler, and they got some beautiful prints made that looked fantastic up close, even though it's a different Stable Diffusion process to get them upscaled that doesn't integrate those fine tunings, but they looked amazing. The impact of seeing them on the wall was really unexpected. I had seen physical printouts before, but seeing them in an art space, the short conclusion of it is that it immediately felt like art. There was no novelty feeling to it. There was an interesting aspect to like knowing that there was this very important like complex process behind the production of the images, but that's kind of true of like any fine art that you end up being engaged with. Is there's a process and a context. But there really was no moment of like, this doesn't feel like art walking in. And I ended up doing workshops up there with the students and folks from the community that they advertised to for 5 days. We just did them every night to see where they went, and every night it was sort of like another renewed surprise of not having anybody respond by sort of like obstinately thinking it wasn't art, or having that conversation, getting into like an ownership, copyright conversation, which would have been interesting also, but definitely noteworthy that nobody seemed to be taking the position of not feeling like it was art. And I'm not sure it's art still, but it felt like art, and that's really the only metric that can guide you. We can talk a little bit more about what that means to me, at least, towards the end here. But yeah, it was just a really fantastic opportunity, and the energy around it with the workshops was equally fantastic, and it was great having not just art students and artists show up to it, but we had a bunch of scientists affiliated with the university show up also, or a few, I should say. I don't know what a bunch technically is. But really interesting perspectives, good energy, and it ended up feeling like a really nice excuse to expose art students specifically to learning Python, being comfortable with Colab notebooks, these things that can be very empowering but also very intimidating from the perspective of a young person who is trying to figure out how the heck they're going to survive in this world and also make art. So that felt like a very positive aspect of it also. And then before, again, we go into just like looking at some art, which is probably the point of this presentation ultimately, and getting some Q&A time in maybe. For whatever it is worth, it just felt important for me to like kind of go through the thought process of what my studio practice is related to this stuff. I'm sort of actively soliciting other artists to describe the same thing to me. But as of right now, I have noticed that what I will end up doing when I have studio time, again, I have a 3-year-old and I have a software job, so studio time is good, but always limited, no matter what. But I will generally either like sit down, do a new training, often based on open images from specifically the Met Museum's like open access site. It's the site is just their whole collection, but the part of that collection that is open access, I'll kind of explore those, feel like some sort of feedback, studio inspirational feedback from a certain time period, like these ones in the middle were based off of a training that was from some ancient Near East zodiac coins. Super interesting kind of stuff that's just like buried in this massive art collection at the Met Museum and photographed and perhaps very rarely looked at. But I'll do a training with some set like that, potentially, maybe a set of like my drawings or paintings, or I will find a new compound token or token pairing through the live application that just works. It's like maybe 50-50 or 1 in 3 that will just click. It randomly pairs tokens together. And when it works, it interestingly seems to have like an 80 to 90% like efficacy rate. Like if it works once at making something interesting or inspirational, it'll work pretty consistently, which is one of the interesting aspects of the compound token or compound concept tab. And then I'll batch prompt out like 500 to 1,000 images. I will usually give them no text prompt except the tokens for those trainings. There's a really great Stephen Wolfram write-up. I don't think it's a blog post technically, but paper that he posted about alien minds that discusses, amongst other things, like the importance of allowing these diffusion models to free associate by not prompting them. Really cool write-up, super articulate. Obviously, it's a very good read and contains other stuff, but kind of backed up what I was noticing, which was that they seem to want very minimal prompts, or they would do the most interesting things with minimal prompts. So I'll get like 1,000 of those. I have started actually just printing them out with a little like another Colab tool that just like tosses together a giant PDF to make a printer struggle really hard to process and print out. And then I'll just have those physically around. And when I'm having studio time, it can just be like sort of screenless, going through these proof sheets essentially and finding interesting images, sometimes identifying one of them and running that image along with its seed through this seed cropping tool that is kind of an interesting other thing to discuss, that by just cropping parts of that static seed off of the bottom, just really kind of lazily and or cleverly creates really interesting variants off of individual images and manages to make, like, if you find an image you like, it will produce 9 or 10 or 15 interesting variants of that image that you will also probably like. That's available on the site too, but it's an interesting one that that I'm still kind of trying to figure out what to do with. But sometimes I'll run some images through that, but essentially I'll just make paintings and drawings like from those images. They make me want to make art. And I, for right now, don't feel like it has to be more complicated than that. And it feels very much like making still life drawings or observational like landscape drawings, except that it feels involved in something very interesting technically. And yeah, it doesn't feel like it has to be much more complicated than that for now, for me at least. And I'm curious, like as more artists spend time with these, like what they will conclude on also. And again, I mentioned the sort of like historical exploration or critical insight, collaboration, so on. That is all in there too in terms of like what the motivations are to continue working with these. But specifically, there's a couple of trainings that are interesting from that historical standpoint, like the coins of those cave paintings. They feel like they're meaningfully filling in sparse constellations of preserved art historical like artifacts. So like there's only X number of preserved cave paintings, like maybe a few hundred like on the planet that have been really well preserved, but there is every needed bit of evidence to imply that there were like thousands, millions of cave paintings being painted outside, not in caves, on bodies, and in caves that just haven't been discovered or weren't preserved, that existed that we'll never know about. And that was a feeling with that cave painting training, that it really looked to me like a meaningful attempt to show me images of the other cave paintings that we will never actually be able to see. And there was a feeling of like rigor in that. It didn't feel like meaningless free association. It felt like a real attempt on the part of Stable Diffusion, that process to make very educated guesses at what those other artifacts might look like if they did exist. So in terms of what's next for this project, we've got the show in October that we're going to do like a very different kind of installation with. That'll be a little more like insano, overwhelming, with a lot more images up to see how that feels. It's a similar size space. It should be very interesting. We're probably going to scale it down to do like weekly artist workshops and try really specifically to reach out to faculty like at UC Davis and other colleges that are in our little area in Northern California. We're still experimenting with implementing or getting a meaningful tool built out using the kind of latest, sexiest version of Stable Diffusion, SDXL, and these LoRa models that you may have like encountered. But they, in short, they feel like they are very, very good at doing what everybody wants these things to do, which is illustrate things well. And I have not yet gotten a sort of SDXL side project to be really good at making images that can take a lot of different formats on, like that can embrace sort of like this photographic weirdness that, I don't know, in our conversations at least seems to be attributable to just the fact that these are trained on like the raw internet, sort of, not really, rather than being pushed really hard towards illustrative capabilities. But that's continuing also. And then my personal plan is just to make more human art. I really like that my takeaway from all this work has just been wanting to make analog work more, not less. I really didn't know how that was going to feel. I've spent a lot of time working on these tools and this app and so on, and it feels like the payoff. There was some insecurity I think I had about like not making work that I felt like I should be making, the work that really feels like traditional artwork. And I am just personally very happy that that's kind of where it ends up getting left for me. But I'm also trying to find more opportunities to like show the work, do workshops, and also folks to collaborate with, or opportunities to get some aspects of this project closer to like the machine learning and research side of all of it. It's a common problem with Stable Diffusion projects and a lot of machine learning projects that you don't want it to get stuck in like a push button mode. And yeah, it's kind of like a goal, mid or long term. So just re-asking those big questions before looking at some images to have them in my mind and perhaps yours also. Can these diffusion models make fine art? What would it mean if they could? And my little sub-questions of asking if it would change the way we thought about collaboration, if it could change the way that we thought about artistic ownership and authorship, if it could change the way that we thought about ourselves as like an art-making species, or just about creativity in general. So some sub-thoughts to that, but then we can just look at some work. And these are in roughly chronological order, so that's a cave painting one. This was a training that was an artist that produced very few works in their lifetime that a few of us from Recurse went to see a show of, and one of the most like amazing trainings we did. Again, feeling like kind of an art historical constellation filler for an artist that didn't make that much work. This was from that University of Alaska artist. And all the training images used for these can be found through the static site also. They're linked, and they're also just on Hugging Face in their concepts library, which is, there's a lot of private concepts, I guess, but it's open for the most part, and you can see what images were used to train concepts. But that previous one and this one were the first time an artist had given us just images that inspired them from their studio, like random magazine clippings that they found on the street, or weird pieces of strange jewelry that they found, or fossils that they had dug up out in Alaska specifically with this artist. And I really thought it was going to be like a garbage in, garbage out scenario of like bad photographs would make for a very bad training. And it was shocking how good those trainings were at making images that seemed greater than the sum of their parts in terms of the training images, but also just extremely interesting for the same nuanced reasons that I was interested and other people were interested in that artist's work. It's a coin training, and then moving into these like compound concepts or compound training ones where you have more than one token. And I kind of promised I would imitate my reactions to these when they appeared at 2 in the morning in front of me. I think this one, I said something like, "What? Are you serious? What? Are you kidding me?" Especially knowing who the artists were that it was trained on. It was like, what? Come on, that's ridiculous. Like, what? Are you kidding? This, like, I want to own that, I believe is what I said. And the seed is listed on these too. For whatever reason, I just started recording them. I think this one was just like a, what? Like, what do I even do with that? Like, I want it, but I don't know why. Oh, come on. That's not, I can't make a painting that good. That's ridiculous. I don't think I had a reaction for this one except I want it. It's just a good painting. I don't know. And obviously this could go on and on. There's like hard drives and hard drives worth of these, but I try to keep it limited so maybe we can have some Q&A time. Here's my little thank you list for the collaborators, both anonymous and not anonymous, that contributed art to this and work and energy and inspiration and guidance. It has really been a community project and the most rewarding community project I have ever done with other artists and tech folks. My contact info up there and a explicitly stated invitation to anybody that wants to collaborate. This is very much set up to just collaborate with openly. If you hop onto the Discord, anybody, probably me, can explain the process, but it's also fairly self-explanatory. You can pop open a textual inversion training Colab notebook. You can run it for free. You can train a concept for free on Colab in a few hours, and then it'll get loaded automatically onto that live application, and then you can make weird art in response to it. So I will, again, just encourage you, if you want to join the Discord and check out more images, they're all on there. You can just lurk. You could also share anything you're doing. I'd be curious to keep in contact with any of you. And then I have this repeat info up there with a placeholder. How much time do we have? Off. Okay, so Q&A, follow up with me. If you have any questions, I'd love to talk about any or all of this. And thank you all for coming.